It's me, Thunderous, and JC, and we're talking about Islam. We're looking at the historical. What was the history of Islam, right? What was the background that it found itself in? What was the culture, the history? What does the archaeology tell us? Think about it. Before Muhammad was born, what was the culture of the area that he lived in? And what were the stories they told? And what we've discovered is it was heavily pagan. It was also heavily Jewish, as we well know, but we were looking at the pagan influences, and we have found that the Islamic literature is littered with paganism, astrological symbolism, and of course, the moon god of Babylon. And this is all very much littered throughout the literature of Islam. And yeah, so today is our final episode. I think we've got about 20 slides, and we hope to wrap this up. And hopefully all this has made great sense to you in the audience. So, Thunderous, JC, welcome. What do you guys think of what we've all covered in this series so far?
I start. Well, for me, this has been wonderful. It's been a very, very good series. It really works really well with all of the other research that I have been doing, and everything points at these people just making up stories. The Quran is full of stories that are actually not there. People just created the stories and put them on top of the text, and it looks like that was happening across the board. Everything in the Sunnah and the Sirah and even their traditions is about them inventing stories to give credence to their new religion. So all of this makes sense with everything else that I'm seeing from the Quran and the Sirah. So it's fascinating. It looks like they just created a religion that was a Frankenstein monster by putting together from all of the traditions they could think of.
Right. Yeah, Thunders, any thoughts from your end?
Yeah, I think it's interesting from a historical point of view as well as archaeology that these things tend to get grafted on from one religion to another. You can change the name, but the modus operandi is the same, or the pattern is the same. And we're finding that with Islam. And it's interesting that some of the things that you've been bringing out and probably likely to bring out tonight, we're going to find clues within the biblical text as well, so we can trace the history of these pagan or false beliefs that have no relation to the God in the Bible, because in fact the people who had these icons or were from that area were actually enemies of God. So
correct. I mean, for instance, we now know that, like with Dr. Ahmed Al-Jalad, he's been translating some recently found inscriptions, and from the archaeology we know that Allah was around 1,000 years before Muhammad. And we know that he was a pagan deity, right? So we also know from other evidence that he was the god Baal. He was the god Shin, the moon god, right? We also know he was also known as Makkah. And there happens to be a city in Arabia called Makkah that's very important to Muslims, and so on and so on. And then also think about it, the name Abdullah. This was the father of Muhammad was called Abdullah. Yet, according to Islamic legend, or the Islamic narrative, he goes to hell, even though he's worshipping Allah. So Allah could not have been the Allah that Muhammad supposedly speaks of in the Quran. It must have been a different Allah. So yeah, Allah has had more than one identity. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think for me, it's when you go to certain places in the Bible, the crescent-shaped moon seems to be grafted onto a lot of religions. And Islam is monumentally represented by the crescent-shaped moon. So you know, you can draw, everyone can look at the history of Islam and its God via archaeology and history, and you can join the dots.
It's amazing how Muslims keep saying, well, no, the Turks added the moon symbol in the 18th century, and it's not got nothing to do with Islam, except it's on top of every mosque. And if you had to remove, why didn't you just remove it from every mosque? Why didn't you just remove the moon and star symbolism completely then, if it's got nothing to do with Islam? It's like us trying to say the cross has nothing to do with Christianity. You would rightfully declare us to be a little bit insane. So therefore, what would they replace the moon and the star with if they got rid of it? And can they get rid of it? The answer is obviously no. They're lying, because it is a religion of the moon.
Absolutely.
Right, well, let's pick up where we left off last time. So hello and welcome, everyone. Just Janice. Hello there, Sandro. MA552. There's a guy called Quranic Endgame and some guy called Thunderous making comments in the chat. It looks like spam. And Panonsky and Freddie Churro. Happy birthday, Freddie. Thank you for the birthday wishes. So you may as well just wish everybody, Freddie. Just make everyone happy. Okay, so I'm going to pick up where we left off last time, or just before where we left off last time. On the right here is Sheikh Ibrahim Al-Qattan, head of the Islamic Sharia courts in Jordan, with Ismail Balogun, Department of Religion, University of Ilorin, Nigeria. Right, this is 1981. And he states here, I'm going to repeat this from last time, but it's been a while, about the gods Oratal and Allah. Herodotus, Greek historian from 450 BC, tells us that the North Arabians had a god and goddess named Oratal and Alilat. So yeah, Allah, Alat, Al-Ilah, Al-Ilat. Yeah, sounds like male and female consorts, the male and female goddess. Oratal is a corruption of Allah. So you have Allah and Alat. Al-Ilah, Al-Ilat. Interesting. So it's a corruption of Allah, or Allah Ta'ala, Allah Most High. Allah has been around in pagan Arabia long before Muhammad was moved to zeal on his behalf. So that is this Muslim sheikh telling us this. And Islamic Sheikh Ibrahim Al-Qattan, in a lecture given to the International Progress Association in Vienna, said that the religion of Arabia can be traced by the epigraphic and inscription evidence back to 500 BC or 1,000 years before Muhammad. Hey, so I wasn't just making stuff up. He said that they had gods named Baal, Shaman, Du Samawi, and Rahman, which they got from Syria, Persia, and the pagan Kabbalist Jews, and Allah. Isn't that fascinating? That all seems to line up with everything I've been saying, right? According to Sheikh Ibrahim, Allah was the highest deity. His name was inscribed in stone by Jewish traders along the Arabian trade routes. These paganized Jews also called him Rahman, while the Arabs called him Allah. It is clear that these sacred concepts, that Allah, the Kaaba with its black stone running around the Kaaba 7 times, climbing Mount Arafat, as well as the god name Rahman, and stoning Satan, which Muhammad got by quote-unquote revelation, was salvaged from the dung heaps of ancient paganism in Arabia. So we have learned that Allah is not the Elohim of the Bible, and we see now that he did come from the era before Islam. But what is the primal origin of Allah's name? And how far back can we trace Allah's steps? That is a really interesting set of ideas this guy puts forward. What do you guys think?
Well, I think that the name of Allah is obviously very interesting, and people have been debating as to where it really comes from. Now, people seem to think more than ever before that is Al-Ilah, that then becomes Allah, and also from other places like Allah and so on. So I think it's probably yes, because it sounds okay and it becomes one. But it shouldn't really be this difficult. If you think about it, there should be more than plenty of evidence to trace everything back. I suggest that a lot of the information that would give these answers has already been destroyed. That's why it's so difficult to make sense of this.
Right. Yeah, but their own hadiths say that Tawaf is pre-Islamic tradition. Yeah, that's so there's a great deal. I mean, we know from Islamic writings that date back centuries that roughly 95% of like what we would think of as modern Islamic practice is actually based on Gnostic moon god religion from long before Islam, which we've covered in the series. So yeah, let's talk about the moon temple of Shin in Arabia. Right, Shin is the moon god of Babylon. That's the Babylonian god, right? And he becomes the god of Yemen. He's the god of Arabia, and then of course he becomes the main god in Central Arabia. So this is from reports of the Research Committee of the Society of Antiquaries of London, or Antiquaries, the tombs and the moon temple of Hadramaut. That's Yemen. That's Oxford, right? So this goes way, way back. Synopsis: the moon temple, the first to be excavated in Arabia, stood visible from afar on a slight eminence in the cultivated valley. Its main facade overlooks an artificial depression, possibly connected with the temple service. On the other 3 sides is a complex of still buried buildings, which may form part of the haram. The site was enveloped completely in drift sand, and local tradition knew nothing of it. There were stumps of stone pillars. We know that the stone pillars were associated with the moon god worship, where they had pillars, which of course, in the Old Testament, God says, do not worship pillars, pillar idols. The orientation of the building follows the Mesopotamian practice, think Babylonian, of setting the corners to the 4 cardinal points, which is very similar to how the Kaaba is set. The main facade looks southwest. It has twice been extended. The latest building phase is represented in a small complex of stone shrines and altars. Formal inscription and 9 graffiti are used and reused, all except 1, or perhaps 2, which are Sabaean or in the Hadramautic dialect. So you're talking about Sabah, right? Muhammad was a Sabi, and this is, of course, Yemeni. Professor Rickmans traces both paleographic and phonetic developments from an archaic group through a transition to a more recent series. There's no absolute dating, but they cover the period of time in which the temple buildings grew to their final form. In 22, the dedication to Shin is preserved. The deities Dat Himyan, Haol, and Al-Makkah are also named. Interesting. We've just spoken about Ka'el and Al-Makkah previously. And they speak of what clinched the evidence is this disintegrated mud brick, which further supported by scarce shards and masonry fragments, some finely dressed, one of which bore the letters Shin. So that was very interesting. That's the Moon Temple of Shin in Arabia. And they speak of a monolith and an incomplete Shin invocation is archaic, and it invokes the moon god under the Sabaean name of Al-Makkah, or the Makkah. So we're back to Makkah, we're back to knowing that this was very much in practice in Arabia. The moon god practice was very strong in that part of the world, all over that part of the world. Any thoughts before I go on?
Not from me, I'm good.
Yeah, Shin and Baal flow into Allah. That is something. So maybe you should do a series defending the arguments against the one atheist and some Protestant denominations which accuse Roman Catholics of copying paganism. I mean, it's the same argument that Muslims make against Christianity. It just, it's one of those things. But of course, I will be doing a series on the origins, the foundations of Protestantism as well. I've done several, but I will do more, because once you look at the people who influenced the reformers, where they got their ideas from, many of these ideas come straight out of Islam, but that's something we'll cover at length. Let me see. So let's go on here. They speak of architectural influences, right? Creative of the Moon Temple, Babylonian and Western pagan roots. So assimilation of foreign models is manifest. So in other words, it was common for this religion to absorb ideas from other religions it encountered. So it would borrow statues, it would borrow symbolism, it would borrow all sorts of ideas and concepts from other religions. You could see that it took ideas from these pagan Jews or these heretical Jews and so on, as we just discussed a couple of pages ago. Its orientation, as well as its tutelary deity, are rooted collaterally far back in Babylonia. So while it's maybe, so it comes from a Babylonian source. And then the Persian Empire, right, through Assyria. So you've got these multiple different influences, like the angels Harut and Marut. Islam gets Harut and Marut from Horot and Morot, which comes from Armenia, right, from Armenian pagan religion. And Armenian pagans got it from the Persians. So again, it's just this kind of development, and eventually they want to claim it's all somehow Abrahamic, when clearly it's not. Any thoughts, guys?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask the question, when it talks about the assimilation of foreign gods, do you think that this is very similar to what the Romans were doing in the 1st century with Paul? Because in Paul's day, I think it was in Ephesus, they had an altar to the unknown God. So you get the idea that they just didn't want to offend any god, including an unknown God that they didn't know. So this assimilation is a mechanism of worshipping gods, but also assimilating gods that they don't know for a fear of offending them.
Yeah, you're right. But also it could be that, no, all religions are equal, or no, actually we are part of your religion. So maybe they were trying to ingratiate themselves. So there's probably... So Catherine says a popular online Christian channel is still saying the Middle East calls God Allah. Now look, Catherine, as far as I know, we've covered this at length on the channel. I know I've spoken about it, various others have spoken about it, including Usama. But because of the heavy influence of the Arabs and Islam, when they conquered, when they invaded and imposed their culture and their concepts on Christian societies. Remember, every single country they invaded was at one point mostly Christian, right? Except for maybe the Buddhists in Afghanistan. But effectively, these were all Christian countries that they imposed themselves on. And Christians know from the Bible the name of God is Yahweh, right? This is something we all know. However, within the Arabic dialect, or within Arabic, for the Christians, it means the God. And the God, which is just a definitive article, right? It's a definite article, the God. But the God has a name, Yahweh, right? Whereas for Muslims, Allah is the name of God. That's his actual name. That's not meant in the sense of the God as in a definite article. It's his name, like Peter or John or Baal or whatever you want to call him, right? Crazy Frank. That's his name. So there's a difference here. And of course they don't. Yeah, so these people are just being dishonest. Okay, yeah, so let me see.
I guess before we move on this, because you mentioned Al-Jalad. So one of the things that Al-Jalad said is exactly this thing that you have here on a screen, that in some of these inscriptions, if I remember correctly, he found, I think it was the story of Noah, and it was, I think it was of Noah, saying that in the Bible it mentions false gods that people were praying to, and in these inscriptions, it actually had the same story, but having the gods, the pagan, the Arabian gods. So basically they just replace them. They take the
Yeah.
story of Noah and just replace the names. So exactly what you are saying here.
Yeah, I mean, he speaks of, in here they speak of a rubble-filled platform of the Hadramaut temple and rustic copings already present in the earliest building might derive equally from Persia, Phoenicia, or Asiatic Greece. And they speak of these buildings in South Arabia were indebted to the Near Eastern Asiatic world of the last 5.5 centuries before Christ. And this is well exemplified at Martyrs, where Glaser reported evidence for leaden clamps upon the masonry. So in other words, you've got affinities, that's 7th to 5th centuries affinities with Syria, 6th to 4th century affinities with Persia, and so on and so on. This is a hodgepodge of every religious idea just stamped on the region. Yeah, so this is borrowing from every religious idea you can think of. So it is the copy-paste religion. Yeah, I'm not sure. You know, Muslims will go online and just lie, right? But everyone knows that Allah is Allah. That's his name, right? Whereas the Christian God has a name, Yahweh. His name is in the Bible like, what, 8,700 times? So God is not confused about what his name is, right?
Yeah,
So,
sorry, yeah, I was just going to say on the name that it's in the Hebrew text alone, actually there as the article represented by the 4 Hebrew consonants as Yahweh, 6,973 times. And I think they've found actually other copies where you can actually add another 30, 40 occasions where you can put the definite article or the name rather, or the tetragrammaton, and something like 275 in the Greek. So you've only got to look at history. There are artifacts and manuscripts, there are carvings with the tetragram actually in it. The name of the God of the Bible is not some mystical, distant name that nobody knew. This is a known name in history, and only the stupidly perverse or hopelessly ignorant would actually try and challenge that.
Yeah, I mean, you can find carvings going back, what, 2,300 BC or something, of the name of Yahweh. You have the Shasu of Yahu, right? The Shasu of Yahu. That's early Israelites inscriptions in Africa, just below Egypt. I mean, in southern Egypt. So it's, yeah, he goes around quite a bit. So now, Carlton S. Kuhn, trade links and war gods, right? He's also an archaeologist. Their surface message is clear. The kingdoms of southern Arabia, like that of the Nabateans further north, were in contact with the entire ancient world, from Rome to India and perhaps beyond, including China. Objects of Roman, Greek, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Babylonian, and Indian manufacture abound. Remember, these were like the 4th largest empires in history at the time, right? These were not small fry civilizations. Scarabs, amulets, that's obviously then you're looking at Egyptian, bronze statues in the Roman manner, dragon feet, think China, grape bunch ornamentation in the Syrian and Byzantine manner, and Grecian columns, Greek columns, all witness their special linkage of this region with the Mediterranean, and the names of gods monotonously repeated. The abundance of seated votive idols and ex-votives, from phalluses, that's fertility. Well, phallus is a winky, right? Men have winkies and women have vajayjays, right? So from phalli to oxen indicate a devotion to religion and a belief in divine cures. So you're looking at also obviously a fertility belief. Animal figurines, right, with humpless camels. And at some point between the two dates mentioned in southern Arabia came into prominence as a highly civilized agricultural region, flourishing near the source of the incense trade route, which went up from the Hadramaut around the western edge of the empty quarter to Mecca, Medina, again Makkah, Al-Makkah, and the ports of the eastern Mediterranean. It served as the principal or only route by which goods from India were transshipped and carried overland. And remember, trade routes were the internet of that time. Any thoughts, guys, before I go on?
No.
Okay, so
And
there
I
are
believe
two.
that you've mentioned before as well that some, say, figurines, some of these idols, they could actually go all the way from Greece to the Arab lands, and then they're worshiping it. So there was a lot of moving of icons from different places, and then they
Yes.
just give it a name, right?
Yeah, and of course, then the Western scholars find it and go, "Hey, that's the that is the idol of Jupiter. They must have worshipped Jupiter." No, they liked the idol, they bought it, and then they called it something else because they were using it for a different purpose. Yeah. So there are two Sabaean periods. The earlier called the Muqarrib period. So we already spoke of Makaraba. Makaraba, the supposed earlier Mecca, but this is a Yemeni term, the Muqarribs, right? And in which the king bore the title the Muqarrib, which indicated a primarily priestly office. So the Muqarrib was a warrior priest king, and he had his retinue, his followers, right? And the later, in which is called the Malik. So you went from Muqarrib to Malik to the Amr to the Sheikh, to the Caliph. So obviously they wanted to get rid of the association of the older religion, so they created the Caliph. But before that, it was the Amr, the Malik, the Muqarrib. So this is actually just part of a tradition that just carried on. The name changed, but the office is very much there. So the common Semitic word for king and a parallel transition took place in Kataban. The most important Muqarrib of Saba was Kariba Ilu, the priest of the god Il. And we know Il was El Makkah, right? The god Makkah. And he killed 4,000 men in a war against Kataban. Then he turned on Ma'an and killed 45,000. He took 63,000 prisoners and 31,000 head of cattle. His army laid the Najran country waste, that's southern Arabia. He destroyed the Manaeans forever. And two Assyrian inscriptions dated 715 and 685 BC locate this Kariba Ilu accurately in time. What he says at the end, though, in his analysis is that basically Islam today is just a continuation of the old Yemenite culture, where you had the warrior priest king who made war in the name of his moon god, right? Because the moon god was always a war god. And here you've got more evidence of that. MA552, it's no one's birthday. It's just that it's Freddie Churro's, whenever I stream, it's my birthday. So thank you, Freddie, for remembering my birthday. So he wishes me every time because he doesn't know when my birthday is. So he just hopes one day out of 365, he'll get it right, which is okay. Except he doesn't send me presents, so that's not okay. So, it's plus and minus here. All right. So, yeah. Okay. So, yeah. So now we know that the warrior priest king served the moon god that was a war god and demanded jihad against everyone else. And the Muslims are carrying on this tradition because they're simply carrying on the title just under a different name. Any thoughts before I go on?
Yeah, I think part of this thing about changing titles, I think part of Odon's thesis is that even the title Caliph was first used by Abdul Malik, meaning the successor of God or the successor on earth. And by the time that we get to the Abbasids, it's still Caliph, but it is now the successor of Muhammad. And now I was actually looking at a source preparing for Wednesday that refers to Umar as king, not Caliph or anything like that, but actual king. So it looks like these titles were quite important, but they did change quite a bit, not only BC, but also AD.
Yeah, and the traditions go on way before Muhammad. They go on 1,000 years, 1,500 years before Muhammad. I mean, so we realize there's a lot more going on here. So Islam didn't come out of nothing, although they like to claim. It's just a continuation of the pagan tradition of before. And then Abraha or Elias Gallus, right? Because there's no Mecca. They speak of, right? In 24 BC, Elias Gallus led an expedition to conquer the whole section. That's of Arabia, right? Known to the Romans as Arabia Felix or Happy Arabia. But the Romans never got there. Somewhere in the sands near Najran, the majority of them perished. And those who survived at this point turned back. They had to walk, right? And nobody found any Mecca. Nobody found anything. So about 270 AD, the Aksumite Ethiopians conquered Arabia Felix and ruled it. There were Christians and set up bishops and bishoprics. By 378 AD, apparently, their rule had come to an end. The Aksumites were the descendants in whole or in part of earlier immigrants from the Yemen. who had carried Semitic civilization to Ethiopia and there became Christianized. Right? So what do we have? The 100 moon god attributes are Allah. So there's the prototype of the modern Zawiya and its sheikh or faqih existed in pre-Islamic Sabah. So the ideas that are in modern Islam of the sheikh or the faqih, right, the holy man, these are not new concepts. They're based largely, I think they were trying to copy the model of, say, the Jews, the Christians from the biblical model, but it's embedded in a foundational template that is essentially of the culture, the Arab culture. So they wanted to claim an affinity with the biblical people, the biblical narrative, yet retain the Arab culture, and the two don't mix very well, but they were copying Arab culture. So they're not Abrahamic. They simply claim to be. Yeah. Islam is the religion of every religion. Yeah. Lloyd's pronouns are maybe and neighbor. Okay, the inscriptions consist largely of the names of gods, of which over 100 are known. Many of them are attribute names. So when they say there's like 360 gods in the Kaaba, it doesn't mean there's 360 gods. These could be aspects or attributes of God. Like for instance, and I've spoken before, you can see the Church of Christ the Redeemer. You see the Church of the Lamb. You see the Church of the Light of the World. You see the Church of the sacrifice. You see the Church of the forgiver or something. These are not different religions. They're all attributes of Jesus. They are all aspects of Jesus. So it's all churches worshiping Jesus, but different aspects of him, right? So Wad is love, Sadiq, truth, and Rahman, the compassionate. And all of these, according to the research, this passed over into Islamic terminology. So they simply took all of the best attributes of the gods of the day, including the Jewish and Christian concepts, and simply absorbed them into the Islamic concept. And these became the names of Allah.
That makes sense then. So I didn't mean to interrupt there,
Go on.
Because Allah would never have had any opportunity in the previous thousands of years to demonstrate those qualities, whereas Jesus in the first century, people can actually see living and walking and demonstrating those qualities. So there's a record of eyewitness testimony and experience of people seeing those qualities of Jesus being manifest, but there's no history of Allah ever doing that, because there's no record of him manifesting in any way. It is just presumption. So that would explain why those attributes have been passed over into Islamic terminology. That makes sense then.
Yeah. JC, you were going to say something?
Well, I can add to that the Quran actually says this directly, what you have just said. The Quran says to Allah belongs all of the best names, which is kind of like a weird thing. And when we go through those names, many of them, they are titles of Jesus. Some actually Muhammad also gets lots of the titles of Jesus. So they actually use these words just to describe whoever it is that you worship, and Allah seems to inherit the majority of them.
Yes, he does. They're simply ascribing, they're borrowing other ideas. Look, guys, there's a chat going on at the moment about Sol Invictus. Sol Invictus comes from something like 275 AD. It's a Roman cult that starts in the late 3rd century. And people claim that Jesus, who comes from the 1st century, was based on Sol Invictus, who comes 250 years later. Now, I'm not exactly a maths Asian, but even I can figure out there's a slight problem with the guy that's born roughly 0 AD being a copy of someone born or created, a fictional god created by a Roman in 275 AD. So if that can stop, that would be nice. Okay, that can go. So yeah. So that would be very nice if you guys can stop, because lots of people are claiming that Jesus is based on this God or that God that comes 300-400 years after Jesus was born. It's fascinating because these gods are based on Jesus. They're cheap knockoff copies. So yeah, that's the basic Sol Invictus bullshit argument. So that stops here and that stops now. And okay, so yeah. And they speak of the god of the Manaeans was Wad, and of the Katabanians Am, and the Hadramis Shin, and the Sabaeans El Mukka, and all of them were the moon. They're just aspects of the moon god. And the moon god, being the greatest god, just absorbed and borrowed and adopted all of the best attributes of whatever gods they encountered in their travels. So Quran 38:5, we can read here. Maketh he the gods one Allah? Isn't that fascinating, JC? What do you think of that? Just that line.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. Lo, that is an astounding thing. And their leaders went about, leave him and cling steadfastly to your gods. Indeed, Muhammad has a hidden objective in this. We never heard of this, even in Christianity, the latest religion. This is clearly a newly fabricated matter. So in other words, he was rolling all of the gods into one. The accusation is made against Muhammad, even in the Quran.
Okay, that's interesting. And actually, yes, because of this thing that you have said actually to the chat. So basically, Christianity is, or all of these things that we see about Islam is the opposite of Christianity. In Christianity, all of these things happen later, and then they're saying, no, 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 Christianity copied from that. But everything that you're showing here is actually the other way around. You're showing things that predate Islam and how they then were used in Islam. But no one talks about that, but they like to say the opposite about Christianity. So this actually sounds like, yes, they're rolling everyone into one and saying, well, Allah is one, and he has all of these attributes, and it's Al-Makkah, Wad, Shin, La, all of these that are the moon god. So very fascinating. It looks like they were all rolled into one.
Yep, and that's exactly. So, yeah. So Official Bengal is obviously, what's the word is, a liar. Obviously, it's a Muslim playing troll. I mean, I think that's pretty obvious. And Muhammad's message was about raping little girls, young little girls, and killing the infidel. But of course, he wants to be very, very ignorant. You cannot argue.
I don't understand how he says that they all had the same message. I don't like getting into these arguments when it's your stream. But the point is that they didn't have the same message because Moses taught original sin from Genesis to Deuteronomy. The whole law, the Mosaic law, was predicated on original sin with animal sacrifices and the atonement. And Jesus came to sacrifice his life in order to redeem mankind as the fulfillment of the law. So that's not the same message. It's not even the same God, because Moses and Jesus used the name Yahweh. It seems strange that Muhammad was clueless as to what the name of Yahweh was, considering that the first 5 books of the Bible would have been inspired by Allah. If that's the case, then how can his name be in those 5 books hundreds of times, literal, not figurative, hundreds of times? Then we can go to the book of Psalms, which is the Zabur, and mentioned in there again hundreds of times, not figurative, literal, and yet Allah can't even find his name once, Yahweh once, in the Quran, or even in the many thousands of hadith. Not the same message.
Yeah, actually, let me add a little bit more to that as well. Lloyd, everything that you're doing here, you're actually showing how everything actually is merged into Allah, and they did the same thing with Muhammad. So when we go through the traditions, we see that they have given him things that Abraham did, Moses, Jesus, and then lots of Arabs. So
and
they created, they just created these stories, just like they're doing here with Allah, with stories that predated these characters, and they rolled everything into one. It's very fascinating.
Yeah. No, they just rolled it all into one, and this is what this guy says back in the 50s. I think he wrote this. Needless to say, this multiplication of God names does not imply an extensive polytheism. All of the names, all of the gods have been reduced to 3: the sun, the moon, and the Venus star. These are respectively represented in sculpture as a disc, a crescent, and an 8-pointed star. Interesting. Each of these 3 had many functions and attributes, each with a name, and the reduction of these to 3 is only exceeded by the Islamic heaping of all attribute names onto a single divinity. Although there were but 3 gods, each might be worshipped separately in different aspects under different names. So it's not 200 different gods, it's 3 gods with different aspects being worshipped by different tribes. Again, you've got, so what do you guys think?
I think with titles that, for example, when we talk about Jesus, every title means something specific. So if you're saying the lamb is for a reason, If you say the sun is a reason, the word a reason, so they mean something. But when it comes to Allah, you get this word salat, which means nothing, because what does it mean that Allah is the merciful when then you see what Sharia says? It's almost like they took the words, but you don't have the stories that show why he has that title attached to it. Only that the only thing you know is if the name sounds good, it belongs to Allah because reasons, without an explanation behind it.
Yeah, he's a counterfeit Yahweh. Muhammad is a counterfeit Jesus. And yeah, the names are they're just gaslighting us. Really, that's what it seems like. Yeah. So yeah, obviously Wikipedia can be good. Wikipedia can be terrible. Okay, I'm going to skip over this. This is not that relevant. Yeah, so I don't think this is, but notice the phases of the moon. Remember, all of these phases of the moon have relevance in Islam, right? Like the crescent moon, this crescent moon is Hiyal, right? Or Hilal, right? Hilal is the crescent moon. And then you've got Qamar, the full moon. So these are different. So there's different gods, different aspects of the moon god. So these we've covered as well. Now, Ilah, these are a phase of the moon god, right? So these are the different phases of the moon, right? Different phases of the moon. So according to our archaeologists here, the god Il or Ilah was originally a phase of the moon god. But early in Arabian history, the name became a general term for God. And it was this name that the Hebrews used prominently in their personal names, such as Emmanuel, Israel, etc., rather than the Baal of the northern Semites proper, which was the sun. Similarly, under Muhammad's tutelage, the relatively anonymous Ilah became Al-Ilah, the God, or Allah, the supreme being. So we know that the influence of the late classical world on the Sabaean kingdom cannot be overemphasized. Greeks or Byzantines must have been imported to the Sabaean state to make statues and carve stone. They brought in skilled workers from all over the world. In earlier periods, Egyptian and Mesopotamian influences were equally important. The South Arabian cities were commercial metropoles of a cosmopolitan character. So they were very international, grafted on a simpler agricultural state, which, yeah, they imported all sorts of things from across the world because they wanted to be part of the wider empires of the world. They were a trading culture. Yeah, they're trying to shoehorn the pagan gods into one single Allah. Exactly. Yeah, Mope did pretend to be the Messiah to the Jews, Jesus to the Christians, and he was the new Pharaoh to his Muslims. Yeah, so that's, let me see if I've missed anything. All right, so, yeah. So the old is the new, and he speaks of the Imamate of Yemen, a modern priestly kingdom. It says the transition from moon, sun, and Venus worship to Islam and from Sabaean speech and writing to Arabic was not as drastic and complete a change as the Yemenites themselves may imagine. Although the trade, so he says the Imam himself, the successor of a long line of holy ancestors, calls himself by the title the Amir al-Mu'mineen, Commander of the Faithful, which is equivalent to Caliph. And this title came before Caliph, before that they had the Malik, and before that the Muqarrab. We've covered all of this previously, so I don't want to rehash things we've covered at length before, but these titles have meaning and specific meaning. The Mu'mineen is, according to the Hebrew, the heretics. Whereas the Muslims stated they took on that name, Mu'mineen, and said, no, we're the believers. So they called themselves the believers in opposition to the Hebrews, the Jews, using that as a term to denote heretics. So they said, no, we are believing the right thing. We are the believers. And they took the term Mu'mineen and they basically made it mean something exactly the opposite. But the Jews used it, there's the Manim, as heretics. And the modern Yemenite system may without difficulty be shown to parallel the social organization of the Sabaeans. That's the modern Muslim Yemeni state. One would not expect it to be identical, for the modern Yemen is the composite remnant of several earlier states, adapted by a shift in religion and by northern influences. He's saying that the current Yemeni system is not very different from the Yemeni system from 800 BC, just influenced by all of the different influences around it. Any thoughts on that?
So do you mean that they kept pretty much everything intact, but they simply just adopted traditions, names, and stuff like it looks like all of the Arabs were very keen on doing?
Yeah, they were the original early religion that was influenced by their trade with Egypt and India and Rome and the Byzantine Empire and Greece. They traded with all these. They were the fourth largest empire in the world at the time. They may have gone as far as China, right? They traveled extensively. We know they went to India. And so Yemeni Muslims today, the whole structure, what you see there is, it's really just a continuation of what was happening 1000 BC. It's nothing different, except that maybe the names have changed a little bit.
Oh.
So, yeah, go on.
Yeah, no, I just said, wow.
Yeah. So now they speak of, this is borrowed Shin, okay? His symbol was the crescent moon. Given the amount of artifacts concerning the worship of this moon god, it is clear that this was the dominant religion in Sumeria, right? So now we're going back towards the Babylonian region, Iraq, and so on. The cult of the moon god was the most popular religion throughout ancient Mesopotamia, but also throughout Arabia, as we've discovered. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Akkadians took the word Shwen and transformed it into the word Shin as their favorite name for this deity. That's Austin Potts, the hymns and prayers to the moon god, to the moon god Shin, PhD, 1971. Shin is a name essentially Sumerian in origin, which had been borrowed by the Semites. He's here not speaking of the Jews, he's speaking here of the Arabs, right? Again, from his PhD thesis. So basically they borrowed not the biblical ideas, but they borrowed the Babylonian religion because it was very popular, very potent, very powerful, well-known. And then afterwards, they would have tried to graft on all of these Jewish and Christian ideas. Any thoughts, guys?
Yeah, I have to ask the question. You've done some excellent research here, and I think many people will be hearing it and observing this for the first time. Certainly I am in many areas of this. And you're quoting scholars, historians, and people who have really delved deep into historic material in order to compile the evidence that we have. What is happening in academia at the moment? Because when you listen to, say, polemicists or apologists for the biblical narrative against Islam, they're not quoting the sources you're quoting, Lloyd. Is there a reluctance on their part, or is it ignorance on their part? Why is that?
Not an unwillingness. They don't want to go there, I think. It's too much of a threat to... I mean, if imagine the college loses its funding, or they encounter a horrific accident with a sharpened weapon coming the other way while they're walking in the parking lot.
Or the library goes up in flames.
Yeah. These things can happen, right? So, yeah, I think there's an unwillingness to deal with this. It's a threat to their livelihoods. It's a threat to their safety. It's negligence. I mean, serious negligence and cowardice. Yeah. I mean, for the audience, does all of this connect? Does the whole thesis make sense? So Muhammad the Sabi, it was said about the Sabaeans of Haran. Remember, there was Haran in Turkey, just over the border from Syria, but there's also the Haran in Yemen, just over the border from Arabia, right? And this was Al-Mahabisha. This was the place of the Ethiopians, where we had the original Kaaba, where Makoraba was, which Muslims say is where Mecca was. But now we know that Makoraba was in Yemen. Al-Mahabisha, and Haran was there too, right? Very odd, because they named the Haran after the moon god capital of Haran in Turkey. It was said about the Sabians of Iran that they used to make a yearly pilgrim to the pyramids of Egypt. Maimonides says that the Sabians are remnants of the ancient Egyptian priests and hierophants who practiced hieroglyphic magic, a system of language encoding that can engineer consciousness. And of course, we know from akhruf, the word akhruf in Islam, it means word, it means a Quranic reading, it does mean dialect, but it also means the science of the akhruf, or huruf, plural, meaning onomatomancy, a magical practice, based on the occult properties of the letters of the alphabet and of the divine and angelic names which they form. What it fails to say here in this very brief definition is it specifically is referring to the Quran. So these people, these Sabians, remember Muhammad was a Sabi, right? And these Sabians practiced a particular word magic, and so did the Muslims practice a word magic based on their holy text. and that's where we get the Akhruf. Thoth of ancient Egypt was a moon deity, although they had other deities who also served as moon deities. And Thoth is Hermes Trismegistus, the father of Gnosticism, right? So he's actually the father of Hermeticism, and then Gnosticism is an offshoot of the Hermetic set of ideas. And in the Hadith, she asked where. They said, to Allah's messenger. She's going to Allah's messenger. She said, do you mean the man who is called the Sabi with the new religion? They replied, yes, the same person. So come along. And they brought her to the Prophet. So Muhammad was a Sabi. We've covered this before. A strange thing, two men met me and took me to the man who is called the Sabi. And that's in Da'if Bukhari, volume 1, book 7, hadith number 340, and others. Someone's asking, can you give us a source about Maimonides? I've covered it elsewhere. I'm actually just repeating something I'd covered much earlier. But you can find this by Googling for it. Just Maimonides talking about the Sabians and the Turks. It's not very hard to find within with Maimonides' quote about the Turks and the Indians. It's not that hard. It's one of his fairly well known. According to the Encyclopedia of the Quran provides the Sabaeans with a religious status comparable to that of the Jews and Christians, but we know that they are moon worshippers. We know that they're pagans. So we know that they're not Jews and Christians, but why does it then? Because Muhammad was claiming to be the Christian. He was claiming to be a Jew. He was claiming to be the, Abrahamic. So clearly this is mistaken, right? But some of them became believers. See, so this is obviously false. So clearly someone's being an imposter here. Any thoughts, guys, before I go on?
Yeah, that thing with Hermes, you've mentioned that one before, and it's been really bothering me because I think, why did they put in their traditions about this guy who receives a book from the heavens, basically like copy-paste of Muhammad, from a completely different tradition? They should have stuck to one thing and just say copy from Jews and Christians, because they are following on those traditions. But it looks like they were very confused early on, and they were just borrowing from all of these traditions that are not compatible at all. It's incredibly bizarre, and the Sabian connection is incredibly odd to put that as part of the Abrahamic faith. It's just really weird.
Yeah, I'm just gonna go for. So someone asked about the Maimonides quote. Let me just get to it. I mean, this is not hard. We can all use Google, I hope, Whereas obviously there are times you should not trust Wikipedia. There are times you certainly can. The Jewish scholar Maimonides translated the book of the Nabatean agriculture, which considered an accurate record of the belief of the Sabians. According to Maimonides, the Sabians believed in idolatrous practices and other superstition, and he provided detail about the pagan Sabians in his Guide for the Perplexed, right? And the Guide for the Perplexed, that's it. And and then also we opened the series with the discussion that the beliefs and the practices of the Sabians from that time are identical, or almost totally identical, with what Muslims practice today. So they're just carrying on an old tradition that long precedes Islam, that is rooted in Hermetic and Gnostic and pagan traditions. So the word Sabah means the one who has deserted his old religion and embraced a new religion. Does it really? Does it really mean that? Did they make that up later? Abu Ailia said the Sabis are a sect of people of the scripture who recite the book of Psalms. Gnostics who used Psalms. Now, okay, so these were Gnostics who used the Psalms. They were people, these Sabis were people who recited the book of Psalms, the Zabur, as Muslims call it. And Gnostics who use Psalms include the Manichaeans. We know those were Gnostics. The Sethians, the Valentinians, the Naasines, and the Hermetics. And Valentinians believed that the Psalms contained hidden meanings and symbolic teachings that aligned with their Gnostic world view. And I see here I've got a Da'if Bukhari quote. This is a very long quote, so maybe I should just look for the word Sabi here. So she said, do you mean the man who is called the Sabi? And he's called the Sabi, yeah. And by Allah, he's either the greatest magician, right? Or he's Allah's true apostle. So, yeah. But understand that now we know that this Sabi are Gnostics who quoted the Psalms. but they're not Christians. None of these groups are Christians. Manichaeans are well-known pagan Gnostics. So are the Sethians. The Valentinians are Gnostics. None of these Hermeticists, occultic magic. They're still the root of occultic magic today. Any thoughts on this, guys?
That quote was kind of funny. If they said either he is a magician or the last of the apostles, it's like, yeah, I think there are other options there of this guy. But yeah, interesting.
Yeah. So Gerd Puen, The Hidden Origins of Islam, right? Edited by Karl-Heinz Ohlig and Gerd Puen. Sabians, Manda, and Gnosis, right? Early in the Christian period, Gnostic movements were quite at home in Syria. Now we know that the main, from earlier writings, earlier discussions, we know that the main statue in the Kaaba was taken from Syria, right? It was Ba'a, who became Shin, right? For example, Martianism spread into Syria, and Osrhoene from the end of the 2nd century onward. Both the Odes of Solomon and the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas appeared in Syria in the 2nd century, as well as the Song of the Pearl in the apocryphal Acts of Thomas, and most likely also the Gospel of Philip. Further, remember they said that the Yemenis were influenced by northern influences, right? Further, both books of Ju, in which Seth plays an important role, Sethians, right, as well as the Sethian Gnosticism and the related Barbelo-Gnosticism transmitted in the Apocryphon of John, should be ascribed to this region. This is also true of the Mandaeans from Manda, Gnosis or Knowledge, who appeared in southern Iraq and Iran. And of their literature, these Mandaeans used the term Nazareans, right? Very similar to Nazarenes, right? This doesn't mean they're from Nazareth, right? As a marker of self-identification. And they're called the Sabians in the Quran. Oh, and Muhammad's a Sabian. The Mandaeans are called, yeah, I think the mystery has been solved. That's what I think. What do you guys think?
It looks like there is a lot of data pointing at Muhammad having absolutely nothing to do with the Abrahamic faith. And even according to the Quran, the Quran comes from other traditions. That's why it says that the scripture is only given to the children of Israel, and he is not. So there is that big gap of information. But it looks like, as people have been studying about this guy, joining the dots, it looks like he had different beliefs and he created a religion by mixing everything up a little bit.
And we know how many stories from the infancy Gospel of Thomas don't appear in the Quran as supposed acts of Jesus.
The main version of Jesus is from the infancy Gospels. Yes,
of Thomas, exactly, right here. So yeah, they're called Sabians in the Quran. So if Muhammad is a Sabi, he may well have been a Mandaean. Right? And that means he's a Nazarene, which is why the Quran might call them Nazarenes or Christians or Nazarites, because they might be confusing with Nazareth. Think about that.
Yeah, and it would also make sense that he would say the Jews, Christians, or Nasara, and the Sabians, they have nothing to fear. If he's from that tribe, he would just put them all together.
Yep, and it's syncretic Hellenism, which is Greek pagan beliefs, also influenced by Persian traditions. So you've got a whole hodgepodge of nonsense, right? And this was from Northern Africa, Italy, Persia, Iraq, Iran. It's from all over the place. So I think you go back to this. Yeah, so as Paul says, the Quran copies the false infancy Gospel of Thomas and presents these as revelations. But these were exposed as heresies centuries before. But the Quran thinks it's revelation from God. And I think the mystery is kind of solved here. At least according to these connections, to me, we have something. So let's move on. Okay, now this is again Tamara M. Green, the city of the moon god, religious traditions of Haran. Now that's Haran in Turkey. Remember, these traditions were not only in Babylon, they were also in Arabia, all over Arabia, because these Yemenis at one point conquered and dominated financially, militarily, economically, culturally, the entire Arabia, right? Since star worship played such an important role in the ancient pre-Islamic religion of the Haranians, and remember, we had Haran in Al-Mahabisha, which is the place of the Ethiopians, which was Makoraba, which Muslims claim Makoraba was Mecca, but we now know it was in Yemen. The term Sabian came to be applied as a generic term for star worshipper or even pagan, and Muhammad was a Sabi, which means star worshipper or even pagan. Any thoughts from you, Thunderous, on all of this?
No, I'm still trying to absorb all this.
I know, it's a lot, right?
It's a lot to take in. All I can think of is that is when your premise is a lie, all you can ever do is lie to defend it. And it just seems that in every sphere of Islamic history that you want to care to look at, you come against a brick wall of no information that relates to a man that actually existed. All you're finding is things, as you've mentioned earlier on, grafted, borrowed, or plagiarized from pre-existing sources, and in some cases reinvented to fit a narrative of a man that may never well have existed.
Yeah. So JC, I mean, look, we've got lots of theories out there. Jay Smith has developed theories. Odon has developed theories. I don't think we conflict. I think we may have different emphases. I think there's room for, shall we say, variation, because none of us can be necessarily definitive. But what do you think of my argument in comparison with some of the other arguments out there?
Well, what I think, and I will explain more of that on the Wednesday show, is that not only different things can be true at the same time. I think that is what happens with Islam, because we cannot deny the influence from Syriac and from the north. That influence is there, but we also cannot deny the influence from the south. And the whole thing really seems to be like they gather things together. Now, when we go to the traditions, it says that, for example, the Quran, even Thabit, when he compiles it, he says, by Allah, if they had asked me to shift one of the mountains, it would not have been harder than asking me to put together this Quran. So I do think that all of these things are probably correct to a degree. They all form what we now call Islam, and we try to harmonize it. We try to say, is this guy who did this one thing, and all of the pieces will fit. I don't think that's the case. I think there are like 100 different pieces, and all of them form Islam.
I think also when too many cooks are trying to make food, right? Too many cooks spoil the broth. So everyone had a puzzle, and then they all started making their own puzzle pieces. So now the puzzle pieces don't fit together because a bunch of idiots were working on it. But, so afterwards you just have a mess. But I think there's clearly something coherent going on behind that story, don't you think?
Yes, I think when you showed as well, like the book of Al-Jasai, like those things are far from this region, but it looks like they took stories from that from that book and from that tradition. But they also took stories from the south of the Arabian Peninsula and also from Iraq. So it does look like everybody's making up stories, and then probably once we get to the Abbasids, they're trying to harmonize everything. And Oron says that that's the time when they come up with the concept of abrogation, when they really start to say, okay, we have all of these stories. Now, by consensus, we have to decide which ones are going to be canon and which ones are going to be daif. And you have a mess.
I think we need to take a canon and shoot the things that are daif, and then we need to shoot the things that are sahih.
Yeah, I'm not really sure if there is much that is sahih. I think sahih means if they liked it more, and daif if they liked it less.
Yeah, but it would be nice if we can just shoot Islamic things with a cannon. So if we can arrange that, if someone can organize that, that'll be much appreciated. Thanks. That's a nice thing for you to say, Catherine. I don't think any other has developed such a coherent backstory to explain the origin of Islam. Well, thank you very much. That's very kind. Yeah. So yeah, these are things that are not yet or have not yet been considered by the guys who focused on the northern thesis, right? The Baghdad area thesis, right? Because we don't dismiss that. I've never dismissed that. I've always said it's valid, but it's not complete. There's at least some percentage, 15, 20% of this stuff, maybe more, that comes from the south that has been ignored. This is all pre-Muhammad and south of Mecca. That also needs to be added to the equation. So Allah, the moon god, according to Berean publishers, why is Allah never defined in the Quran? Why did Muhammad assume that the pagan Arabs already knew who Allah was? Muhammad, there's no canon emoji, sadly, says Andrew. Muhammad was raised in the religion of the moon god Allah, but he went one step further than his fellow pagan Arabs. While he believed that Allah, the moon god, interesting, was the greatest of all gods and the supreme deity in a pantheon of deities, Muhammad decided that Allah was not only the greatest God, but the only God. So people do call Muhammad, Allah, the moon god. In effect, he said, look, you already believe that the moon god, Allah, is the greatest of all gods. All I want you to do is to accept the idea that he is the only God. I'm not taking away the Allah you already worship. I'm only taking away his wife and daughters and all the other gods. But then he rolls them into Allah, right? This is seen from the fact that the first point of the Muslim creed is not Allah is great, but Allah is the greatest. He is the greatest amongst the gods. Very interesting point that they make. So why would Muhammad say that Allah is the greatest except in a polytheistic context? The Arabic word is used to contrast the greater from the lesser. This is true is seen from the fact that the pagan Arabs never accused Muhammad of preaching a different Allah than the one that they already worshipped. This Allah was the moon god, according to the archaeological evidence. Muhammad thus attempted to have it both ways. Yep. To the pagans, he said he still believed in the moon god Allah. To the Jews and the Christians, he said that Allah was their God too. We believe in the same God. But both the Jews and the Christians knew better, and this is why they rejected his God, Allah, as a false God. Al-Kindi, one of the early Christian apologists against Islam, pointed out that Islam and its God Allah did not come from the Bible, but from the paganism of the Sabaeans. They did not worship the God of the Bible, but the moon god and his daughters Alat, Al-Uzza, and Manat. And Dr. Newman concludes his study of the early Christian Muslim debates by stating, Islam proved itself to be a separate and antagonistic religion which had sprung up from idolatry. Islamic scholar Caesar Farah concluded, there is no reason, therefore, to accept the idea that Allah passed to the Muslims from the Christians and the Jews. Very interesting article, very interesting point. Any thoughts, guys, before I go on?
Sorry, go on, Thandros.
Yeah, I was just going to say, for me, it's just a continuation of the comment that I'd made earlier. I'm finding it very hard to believe that in academic circles, the information is blatantly there. What I'd like to question is people like Yasser Qadi. Surely they would have access to this information as well, given the...
I'm certain they do. I think if you look at the structure of their polemics and their apologetics, it's to avoid going here, because they know this is the kind of road that you're going to walk down.
Do you think this is when he talks about red lines and looking at how academic history works, rather than, they won't take, for instance, such like the line of isnads for the hadith. There's academic parameters that they operate in. He must know, when he's using red lines, that this information here uses those academic principles as far as archaeology and history is concerned. That Islam cannot pass this, and if this information does pass the test, then it beggars belief that a person is willing to lie belatedly, not just to himself, but to his audience, to the cost of lives, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Let me find something. Someone is asking me a question. I want to show this. Someone mentioned that the word Allah, let me go here. Allah is actually Hebrew. This is Joel. There's a handful of different meanings of it in Strong's Concordance. Well, just so you know, Allah is from Hebrew H422. It's an imprecation or curse. So Allah in the Hebrew, and you're looking at Islam, is from the root of Silam, meaning graven idol, and Allah is curse, just so we're aware of that. So these all overlap. I covered that much earlier on in the show. Yeah, Muhammad's tribe mocked him. Exactly, Andrew. Muhammad's tribe mocked him. So, yeah, so we're nearly done, guys. I think we're almost done here.
So just on this point, that all of this makes it sound like Muhammad, so this guy appears and he basically he defines God and says, okay, let me tell you what God is like. And then he starts telling all of these things from different cultures. He has no canon, he has no biblical foundation, but he says, my God is that one, but let me tell you all about him, despite of having no idea who is the God of the Bible or anything. He basically is just making up who God is by rolling everything into one.
Doesn't even know the name of the God of the Bible, but he knows the name of a bunch of pagan gods.
Yeah, exactly. So the Christian Prince always says that that Muslims worship Muhammad. He is God in Islam, because he just keeps saying, yeah, you have to obey me because obeying me is obeying God. And then he just does whatever he wants. But it does look like someone just borrowing from everything that is around and then defining God in whichever way they liked.
Yeah, I think, look, I mean, he accepts that there's only one true God, right? At the end of the day, there's such a heavy emphasis on monotheism, but he distorts God. He tries to make him what he is not. So I think yesterday we had a question. I hope I'm going to answer this well. I'm not going to try and dwell on this, but someone asked yesterday about the whole Catholic, in the Catholic Catechism, they said that Muslims and Christians worship the same God. That came up as a question. The idea, I believe, is that Muhammad believes there is one God, and Christians, we believe there is only one God. But it does go on to say later on in the Catechism that the Mohammedans are infidels in that they distort the one true God. They misrepresent the one true God. They disfigure him into a mutant. So they believe there is one God, but they ascribe attributes to him that are not correct. So they believe in the one God concept, but they completely just ruin it. And they state this. So there's a lot more detail. But of course, like, I mean, people who dislike Catholicism are going to find the worst possible interpretation and leave out a lot of context and detail that more clearly discusses what the situation is. And then there's lots of badly informed Catholics on top of that. Okay, I've met lots of very poorly catechized Catholics. So there's that. So Muhammad clearly believes in a monotheistic idea of God, but he's also trying to please a pagan audience. So he's trying to make this God fit everybody as opposed to accepting just the one true God of the Bible. Does that kind of make sense, at least as a simplified explanation?
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, Hamas means to do wrong or violate in Hebrew. That's really, really interesting. Yeah, so there's a lot of this weirdness going on. And yeah, so let's finish here. I think we're nearly done. We've got like 1 or 2 slides to go, 2 or 3 at most. So the city of the moon. So lives in a temple. So the god, this is in Iraq. Okay, this was discovered in Iraq. This is but this is probably not where Abraham came from. This is not that city of It was the house of Shin. So was the house of Shin, the house of Allah. We know that Shin was Allah, right? There's no differentiating between the male moon god and the moon. The Sumerians used the lunar calendar with 360 days. Interesting. Isn't that odd that the Muslims have a lunar calendar with probably 360 days? The moon god, referred to as a bull, and also represented agricultural fertility. And the crescent is horizontal in their latitude. So in other words, in most places you'll see this horizontal crescent. But even in Mecca, they've got the crescent that's pointing upwards, because in certain latitudes, the crescent moon faces up vertically. So it just depends on the latitude. And these people, you go to Mecca, you've got a vertical crescent, right? That's on top of these mosques. Some places you have the slightly skew crescent, and in some places a perfectly vertical crescent. So yeah, from Ailia to Allah, and prostrating to idols. Charles Russell Coulter and Patricia Turner consider that Allah's name may be derived from a pre-Islamic god called Ailia, similar to Il, Ilah, or Jehovah. So a copy of that, right? They considered some of his characteristics based on lunar deities like Al-Makkah, Qa'el, Shakir, and Wad, or to love, to agree, right? And Warak, right? An exceptional representation of some South Arabian gods was found on the low reliefs decorating the pillars of a temple in Wadi al-Jawf, the northernmost region of Yemen, dating back to the 8th century BC. This is 1500 years before Muhammad. A caption identifies each divine image. The masculine figure of Wad is represented standing, armed with an arch and a quiver, wearing a short skirt and horned headgear. So the warrior god, right? The moon god is the warrior god, right? So again, we get back to this symbolism. In pre-Islamic Arabia, and also that also makes you think of what's the biblical passage, guys? Remind me, Thunderous, you're the one who knows the Bible well, of Ishmael supposed to be a wild hunter of a man, a wild ass with his bow and arrow, and apparently he tries to shoot Abraham's son with an arrow. That's why they get expelled with Hagar.
That's Genesis 18, I think.
Yeah. So again, there's symbolism here. There's a borrowing to me of symbolism, plus the overlap with the crescent.
And isn't there as well the whole thing about shooting arrows at a particular pagan god to see if you were going to be favored or not?
Yep.
I think you've mentioned that
divinity with arrows and all that stuff. And then you also think of there's the There's the hunter in the Bible as well, with the arrows, but I can't remember the name. But yeah, so there's certain symbolism that they're borrowing, and then they just mix and match it all. In pre-Islamic Arabia, including in no, this is very true. Panofsky says improper catechism is a big problem today, both in RC and EO. That's very true. In pre-Islamic Arabia, including in Mecca, Allah was considered a deity, possibly a creator or supreme deity in a polytheistic pantheon. And Allah, from Arabic al-Ilah, meaning the God, was a title. Wellhausen states that Allah was known from Jewish and Christian sources and was known to pagan Arabs as the supreme God. Think about it. Muhammad's father was Abdullah, the slave of Allah. Except Muhammad's father doesn't go to paradise, he goes to hell because he wasn't a Muslim. Now, if he was worshipping Allah, why would he go to hell if he was the worshipper of Allah? So that doesn't make any sense. Clearly, Allah was not the Allah of the Quran. Clearly, he was a totally different pagan deity.
Lloyd, can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
It was his grandfather that was Abdullah, wasn't it? Not his father. His father had
his grandfather was
Abdullah. I'm sure his grandfather was Abdullah, and it was his father that had another name. I'm not trying to correct you or anything like that. I'm just giving a correction.
The Prophet's father was Abdullah, and his grandfather was Abd al-Muttalib.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah.
But if they have names, right, does Muttalib have any reference in a religious sense as far as what the etymology of the word is, or his name is? Because names in those days were related to the god that they worshipped.
The servant of the seeker. So it's, servant of the seeker. He's the grandfather of Muhammad, and his original name was Sheba, right? The Sheba, when Sheba was brought to Mecca, okay, hold on. So what is the meaning of Sheba? Let's try and find out what Sheba means. It's a Muslim boy name, which means the gray-haired one, the old one. So obviously meaning wise, obviously with the context of being wise. So they called him Abdul Muttalib, the seeker, because he used to do divination. He would do divination, which is of course a form of Islamic magic. Again, so.
Okay, stand corrected on that. Thank you, Lloyd.
Yeah, Abraham's father was an idol maker, exactly. So the worship of sacred stones was one of the most important practices of the Arabs. Cult images of a deity. I mean, there's the hadith. Oh, something very weird just happened there. Yeah, we just got disconnected there for a second. Everyone back?
Yep.
Okay, we're back. So the worship of sacred stones was one of the most important practices of the Arabs. There's a hadith by Bukhari, I believe it is, that says we used to worship stones, and when we found a better stone, we would throw away the old stone and worship the new one, right? Or Tabari says something like that. So the worship of sacred stones was one of the most important practices. Cult images of a deity were most often on unworked stone block. The most common name for these stone blocks was derived from the Semitic nisib, to be stood upright. But other names are used, such as Nabatean Masgida, the place of prostration, and Arabic duwar, object of circumambulation. This term often occurs in pre-Islamic Arabian poetry. I'm going to go back here to something I showed many times before in the series. Let me just bring this up, because we've got to go right back to the beginning. And we've got to show these things here. These are the kinds of standing stones, right? These are the kinds of standing stones that we used in that part of the world, right? And we've shown others as well where they've got the face carved on them. So these kinds of, here we go. You can see here, you've got the ones with the faces carved on them. So this was very common practice in that part of the world. These are from Jordan, for instance, and they date back 9,000 years. Oops, sorry, my bad. I just accidentally closed my, give me 1 second. Yeah, I accidentally closed my, yeah, not the world's wisest. Accidentally closed my PowerPoint presentation. Let's start again, and here we go. So yeah, okay. So what does this have to do with Ishmael? So Ishmael worshipped idols. Sarah did not want Isaac adopting these habits. He violated married women. He tried to kill Isaac with his bow and arrow while making it look like an accident. Ishmael was quarreling with Isaac about the inheritance, saying, "I am the firstborn and I will take a double portion." They went into the field and Ishmael took his bow and shot arrows at Isaac. And just as you say, Proverbs 26:18-19, as a madman who casteth firebrands, arrows, and death. And he says, I am only mocking. I was just making fun. Trying to shoot someone to death, but just making fun. So God cut short Abram's life by 5 years. He would not live to see his grandson violate the betrothed woman, commit murder, deny God, deny the resurrection of the dead, and despise the birthright. An angel told Hagar before Ishmael was born that he would be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all of his brethren. They're certainly dwelling in Europe today. He became an expert archer, and God was with the lad, and he grew and dwelt in the wilderness and became an archer. Fascinating stuff, and we have this whole idea we just showed earlier. So Wad, Rahmanan, and Hiran. This is the Routledge Encyclopedia of Ancient Mediterranean Religions. Wad, or Wadum, is a major South Arabian divinity whose name is linked to the Semitic root wad, to love or to agree. Is attested in the inscriptions of all the kingdoms of ancient South Arabia, Sabah, Ma'in, Qataban, and Hadramaut, since the earliest writing evidence in the first millennium BC, that's in the first 1,000 years before Christ was born, until the end of the polytheistic times, or in the 4th century. Even in an inscription invoking the sole god Rahmanan, Wad, his father, is added. The cult of Wad was spread in the Al-Jaf area, northwest Yemen, and in the Sabaean territories at several temples. So in other words, the idea of a monotheistic but pagan god became established in Arabia, in Yemen. So they had a monotheistic god, but a pagan version of the monotheistic god of the Bible, right? And they speak of at least one temple of Wad is in Qataban, and of the major tribes of the Hadramaut, the Yazanides, were devoted to the cult of the god. And the 2 temples of Wad are attested beyond the borders of South Arabia in the oasis of Qaryat al-Fal. This is just south of Mecca. And in Dedan, central and northwest Arabia, so therefore the idea of this pagan monotheistic god took hold, right? So besides being the recipient of dedications, votive offerings, and sacrifices, he was the addressee of requests of protection. In the only South Arabian incantation text known, right, the author asked the god for protection from evil, and he curses an enemy. The new moon, Sakhran, in whose darkness the author of the text hides, is found in inscriptions as an epithet of the god Wad. So the new moon, Sakhran, is a name of the god Wad. So the name, their monotheistic god, is still a moon god. Still a moon god. And they speak of Hiran, the watercourse of Wad. The symbol of the god is a snake. Any thoughts, guys?
Yeah, particularly with all of these moon connections. So before I concluded, like, these are kind of coincidences. For example, you showed about the calendar, moon calendar. So before I simply just thought, when the Christians were going with the 365 days calendar, these people were the enemies, so they would just go with the opposite, as it happens in history. I would just conclude those things. But after showing all of this, it looks like nothing is done because they don't like the Christians, so they are going to do something opposite. It's because they have another tradition in there, and that's the thing that they are emulating and that they are still maintaining. So these connections, particularly with the moon, they are incredible, and they happen to this day. You've shown so much, including the looking at the moon and kissing the hand and these sort of things that were happening like probably 2,000 years ago. So very fascinating stuff. It looks like instead of creating a new Abrahamic faith, they created a soup of everything that was around, and much of it in the traditions is pagan.
Yeah, and they created a monotheistic deity, but he was just an updated version of the old pantheistic or monotheistic deity. It's really, now notice this is the coins from the religions of Yemen, right? And here's the symbol of Al-Makkah. And here's the symbol of the Temple of Makkah, and it's kind of a little bit snake-like, right? And this is the Bakka symbol. So there's just something odd about all of this stuff. And then just to try to finish off, because hopefully we're nearly done. Let me just see where we are. We should be, where are we? We are here. So 3 more slides, then we're done. Yeah. So let's speak of Lunis, an Egyptian city known as Khons Lunis, and it has a hawk head surrounded by the crescent and disc. So now you've got an Egyptian link once more, okay? The crescent and the disc instead of the crescent and the star. So that is the crescent, and the disc would be the sun, so the male and the female, as opposed to the male and the child, right? And this is called Thoth Lunis, and we know that Thoth is, of course, Thoth is actually related to Islam. We just spoke of Thoth as one of the gods, one of the Prophet Idris in Islam, and one of the spiritual ancestors of Muhammad, oddly enough, even though he's a pagan god. His worship was extensive throughout ancient Egypt, where he was known as Ah, who presided over rejuvenation and resurrection. Interesting. Lustration, a religious rite practiced by the ancients, consisted of washing. Yeah, washing. I wonder where the Muslims got that. A symbol of the internal purification of the heart. Interesting. Muhammad had a couple of angels come down when he was 4 years old. While he was tending sheep, according to some narratives, he was busy tending sheep. He was a shepherd. Yeah, I wonder where they got that idea of Muhammad being a shepherd. And yeah, they cut open his heart and they removed the sin that was in his heart, a little black dot. So purification of the heart, and a ceremony preparatory to the initiation in the ancient mysteries. Yeah, that could be something that we need to know about Muhammad, because there's stories of Muhammad finding a boy in a cave and the guy's covered in a blanket, and it's all to do with occult mystery initiation. Yeah, and Southern Star Canopus and the Temple of Khons. We've spoken about Canopus is where the Kaaba points to Canopus, right? And they speak of Min, right? So the Menin, the heretics, and Canopus again, and horns and disc that mark a rising star. So yeah, interesting. So now you've got again these connections to the dawn of astronomy, the study of temple worship, and the mythology of ancient Egyptians. Just a few links, again, back to the whole idea of the Kaaba we spoke of in the previous 2 episodes, and the astrological symbolism and connections, right? And let's continue here. Let's just go on. So Gerald Hawkins, setting point of the 3 stars, the handle of the plow. This side of the Kaaba points to the summer sunrise, right? The winter sunset, and the rising point of Canopus. So the alignment of the Kaaba implied by the first section of the text, illustrated in figure 1. So the first of the winds is the Sabah, which is the easterly Kaaba facing the wall, blah, blah, blah. In other words, the Kaaba, as we've spoken about, is a megalith, much like Stonehenge, and it's oriented on various astronomical alignments, right? So it's actually slightly off, obviously. It's a little primitive, I guess, but it is focused on the rising point of Canopus, the brightest star in that part of the sky. And here you've got all of these little overlaps with ideas that are very much linked to Egypt and other places. So Yemeni people were a mixture of Jewish and Christians, and together with a mixture of adherents of indigenous beliefs. The last Himyarite king, Du Nawas, converted to Judaism, and he ordered the massacre of Christians. He wasn't, shall we say, a heretical Jew. Survivors called for help from the Byzantine emperor in the name of the Aksumite Christians of Yemen. This enabled the Aksumites to dominate Yemen and even threaten to control the area around Mecca and Medina. In return, the Himyarites called the Persian Empire for help, which led to the absorption of Yemen into Persia. Subsequently, Yemen came to be governed by the Umayyad Caliphate in Damascus, and afterward by the Abbasids. Author Jean Duress has written in the secret books of the Egyptian Gnostics, Seth is known in Islam and usually assimilated to Agatha Daimon, who is one of the great figures of Hermetic literature. Seth is Thoth, is the prophet Idris in Islam. The prophetic prestige with which the Gnostics endowed him he still possesses, especially in the traditions of Shiite groups, therefore chiefly in Mesopotamia or in Iran. In these particular doctrines, the survival of Gnostic themes is ubiquitous and seems immense. But it's not only amongst the Shiites. This is very obvious, as we've covered previously in the Sunnis as well. Why emphasize the South Arabian area and Ethiopia? Such passages may well detail the practices of residents of pagan Taif. I've been to Taif twice, just 87 kilometers from Mecca. In fact, most of the Quran's agricultural references require a locale no further afield than Taif, famous for its grapes, its pomegranates, and its figs. Only olives would require the growing conditions found in Yemen and Nabatea. In other words, much of what was described in the Quran can be ascribed to some degree to Taif, which is about 54 miles or 87 kilometers from from Mecca. At either end of the Western Arabia's overland trade route, thus almost everything in the Quran's early surahs is compatible with its Hijazi origins. But if you move it north 87 kilometers, or south 87 kilometers, revisionists must reckon with two other facts which argue against Islam's Nabatean origins. There are at least 200 Amharic and Ethiopic loanwords in the Quran. Significant linguistic borrowing suggests extensive cross-cultural interaction. Because Nabatea would be closer to Egypt, you'd expect more words from that part of the world, but there's only about 15. But there's significantly more words from Ethiopia and South Arabia. When goods and ideas are exchanged, words often are as well. Cultural dominance may play into linguistic borrowing also, and Ethiopia ruled the Hijaz during the 6th century. If the Quran's early surahs were addressed to the inhabitants of Petra, you might expect more Coptic words than Amharic and Ethiopic loanwords. Nabatea was much closer culturally to Egypt than to Ethiopia. Yet Amharic and Ethiopic words in the Quran stand in a 20-to-1 ratio to Coptic words. So there is far more links to South Arabia and Ethiopia than to the Coptic, because there's 20-to-1 ratio of words from that part of the world. Any thoughts on that, guys? And then that's the end. This is finished. We're done.
Now, the Book of Acts has Philip speaking to an Ethiopian eunuch. So obviously, he's going back to Ethiopia after he's been to the temple in Jerusalem. So that would suggest that there was a big Jewish community in Ethiopia at the time, and he would have been, as a eunuch, a man of importance.
Actually, the term eunuch in that context actually means a civil administrator. Like
I know exactly what you mean there. But the point I'm trying to get at is he was a man of.
Yeah, he was important. Yeah, he would be if he was sent to Jerusalem to do whatever work in the capital. Then he was an important man. Yeah.
Yeah. So he was reading out Isaiah. Philip speaks to him. So I think what I'm trying to get at is. So there's a reference point of Judaism and Christianity going to Ethiopia in the 1st century. Could that be why the language ratio is 20-to-1 then? Because there would have been educated people and educated in the Judeo-Christian narrative.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the first hijrah is supposedly to Ethiopia. And then, certain ideas they took from like removing the shoes in the mosque, separating men and women. That's what the Ethiopian Christians do, the Eastern Orthodox, I think it's called. Yeah, so there's lots of ideas. I mean, I've covered some of them previously in the show, so I can't remember them all in detail, but I've covered some of these as we've gone through. So obviously this requires also knowing some of the previous episodes. But yeah, that's it. So that ends my monotheism. So your thoughts, guys. Action-packed live stream. Thank you, Just Janice. So yeah, JC, Thunderous, last thoughts on this?
Well, I'd say yes, absolutely. And it really looks like they borrowed from all of the sources everywhere. And because we had the Rashidun period, then the Umayyads, and then the Abbasids, it looks like they created all of these stories in just 100 years, and the whole thing was a mess. But an interesting connection because of the last slide that you've put in there with Taif. So there is in the traditions
and that's from a Muslim
about,
that wrote that, right? This Taif thing is from a Muslim.
Yeah, so there are a couple of connections. One is Muhammad walking into Mecca, basically unopposed. That mirrors pretty much a one-for-one with the story of Al-Hajjaj later doing the same when he's pursuing Abdullah ibn al-Zubayr. So it's exactly the same thing, going in unopposed and just chopping a few heads. That's all. But an interesting connection is that Al-Hajjaj, according to the traditions, he was from Taif. In the traditions, during the time of Muhammad, they left Taif alone. They basically just went. They were actually doing wars everywhere, but they were very nice with the people of Taif. When we go to Al-Hajjaj, so that is during the time of Abdul Malik, this guy Al-Hajjaj was from Taif, and they got special privileges. Also,
Oh.
Al-Hajjaj is then recorded. According to Yasir Qadi, he was a bit of a poet because his father was a reciter of the Quran. And according to Puin, which you've shown on the screen, he said that Al-Hajjaj inserted over 1,000 alifs to the Quran. So we have parallel stories between Muhammad in Mecca and Taif with Al-Hajjaj in Mecca and Taif. Then Al-Hajjaj being said that he was from Taif and editing the Quran. So if the Quran was originally mostly from up north, by the time that Al-Hajjaj gets in power, he may have done one of the canons or one of the canonizations that make it be more pagan. So it's possible that it started very Judeo-Christian, and then through these edits, it becomes
seems to be
more
about
about
Jesus,
what he knew.
but then I don't know, it does seem to be very largely about Jesus, and somehow it just goes weird. I mean,
But yeah, Taif must have been important. I mean, Mecca wasn't there, but Taif was certainly in there, and it keeps appearing in all of the sources. So if something happened in the south, Taif was involved for sure.
Yeah. So I'm sure there's a lot more, but I mean, it doesn't. Everything I've presented here doesn't seem to necessarily contradict by anything by Odon. It doesn't seem to contradict anything said by J. Smith. I think it adds to the discussion. Now, there may be overlap or there may be contradiction in some things, but maybe for Odon in that situation, that is what happened, but then some other guy did something exactly opposite. I mean, those are, it's two things can be true at the same time, just in different places,
Yeah.
So,
I'll try to
yeah.
harmonize it a little bit on Wednesday.
Yeah, but
Wednesday
hopefully
will
this makes
actually
sense.
show, I think.
Hopefully this all makes good sense for everyone, that and the evidence does seem to paint an idea that there's a bit of paganism going on here. Thunderous, last word.
Yep.
Your thoughts?
No, I'm going to be honest and say that this is new information to me. So it's one of those where you have to go through it a couple of times to really grasp the historical context of what's really going on with the origin and roots of Islam. So yet again, I'll just say thank you, Lloyd, for the information that you've provided.
Well, would you call nonsense on it? Did it seem coherent? Did it seem like I was trying to stretch
absolutely. Things? This is why I said earlier on in the chat that it's kind of clear that you've done the research. Yet again, you're providing something new. But the research is already pre-exists. You've just gone and tapped into it. And what I find of concern is that if the information's out there, when you looked at the dates of the sources that you cited, some of it goes back decades. So the information has been there. It's been there for decades, yet nobody else is tapping into the information. And you're the only one that I know of that does. All the other polemicists against Islam don't. And academia itself, and you've mentioned that academia in itself is quite hesitant or reluctant because of financing, but also, you can get your throat cut for revealing this kind of information. That's a reality of the world we live in today. But it surprises me that there is a reluctance on anybody else in presenting this information to the public. And when you consider the importance of it, the reality is, if you're a theist and you look at the biblical narrative, it is a matter of life and death. That is a reality. John 4:24, John 3:16, I can cite all the scriptures. What I find of concern is that people who know this information is out there, you're dispensing it, but nobody else is. That for me is a concern.
Yeah, I think the ideas are filtering through. I think we're being vindicated by, there was a fantastic episode with Al-Kalam and Kalam El, sorry, and Mal. Just check Mal's channel, Islamic Origins. They did a fantastic interview. I think they nailed it, because I think academia is now slowly coming around to this. So we are slowly being vindicated, and these ideas are starting to, the whole pagan origins, the pre-Islamic origins are starting to factor in. And I think other people are using these ideas. I just sent JC something. Actually, let me find it. I just sent JC something. It's let me just see. JC, what was it I sent you a couple of days ago? It was the gods of pre-Islamic Arabia, right? And this was on Religion for Breakfast channel. So the gods of pre-Islamic Arabia, and somehow they were talking about Allah being a pre-Islamic god. So the idea, and this is recent, this is like 3 days ago. These ideas are filtering through. It's finally people are breaking out of the standard narrative.
Yeah, but it's a shame that the information's been there for decades, and you would have thought that those in academia, if they don't want to present the information themselves, that they would advertise that the information is here, rather than just people like yourself having to go and dig for it to see if the information is there in the first place.
Yeah, no. So, but yeah, look, I think we're getting through slowly. I mean, look, we're in a fight. It's them versus us. We all know this. It's how it is. We're in an information war. So, guys, you have the information. It's time you take this information and, metaphorically speaking, YouTube, go to war. Go online, use the ideas, put it out there, and the ideas are based on facts, based on archaeology. Someone has to put it out there, and someone has to start looking at it. It's solid. It's based on literal recorded archaeological evidence. It's overwhelmingly attested by hundreds and hundreds of different researchers and books. And, it's not like it's one guy coming up with a crackpot theory. It's actually supported by hundreds of citations, thousands of citations, inscriptions. There's a whole database of inscriptions. So, yeah, guys, hopefully this was educational. Hopefully you learned something. And, yeah, please use this. Speak about it. We can win. We can win. Just keep talking about it. Don't let them silence the ideas. Speak about the ideas. They're going to make sense. They're going to resonate. There are things in Islam they don't want you to talk about. That red line, it's time to step over that red line. All right. Yeah, Yasser Qadi will never open here. What was that? Will never open his mind to. No, he knows there's a problem. He knows. That's why they don't want you to go walk over that red line, because he knows what you'll start to find. And the whole enterprise is designed to avoid going here. So let's go there.
Yeah, that's what I mean by the information in academia with people like Yasser Qadi. He must know that there is no, and I think when I was commenting earlier on about how academia does research, and they don't rely on somebody said something to somebody and somebody like a chain of isnads. Academia is a lot more stringent in its requirements to test out what is real history and what is fake, is just myth and fairy stories as such. So I can't believe for a minute that Yasser Qadi, as an intelligent man and research man in the location where he is as well, isn't aware of this kind of material. He will have to know it's there in order to judge whether the isnads of the hadith are going to be accepted or not historically anyway.
Yeah. So
actually, about Yasser Qadi, I mean, he did say the narrative has holes in it. So someone should ask him, okay, so what holes are in the narrative? Because it would be great if he actually opened up and said, okay, this is problematic, this is problematic, this is problematic.
Let's be specific.
But instead of that,
yeah, no, that's true. Look, think about it. How many positive arguments do Muslims make? They don't make positive arguments for Islam. They attack Christianity. Right? They attack Christianity. That tells you they don't have a lot to stand on. They don't talk about, let's talk about the coins and think of for Palestine. You don't see them making positive arguments for Palestine with coins and the name of the holy book they had. And here are the temples that the Palestinians worshipped at in 30 AD. They don't have anything. It's all fiction. So yeah, the quality of the argument is low, and we've just got to keep pushing and say, fine, make a positive argument. Instead of attacking Christianity and the Bible, make a positive argument. Convince me with the facts, which you don't have. So, guys, I think we can call it here, right? So, yeah, let's call it tonight. So, thank you, guys. We should be back tomorrow with Usama Doc, and we'll be talking about the Democrats and their support and promotion of Islam. And, of course, the crocodile is just going to eat them last. That's all that's going to happen. It's not that the Democrats are using the Muslims to bring in socialism and communism. It's that the Muslims are using the Democrats to spread Islam. So, yeah, guys, we'll do that tomorrow. So take care, everyone. Good night and God bless.